Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I think it's really important for us to take a bit of time now and again and reflect on the intellectual and the cultural, philosophical influences that made Europe what it really is. And I think there is no better place to start than looking at the contribution that ancient Greece made. One of the things that I did every year for about 30 years while I was a university professor was to talk to my students about the importance of Greece. And there were two things that I always talked about. One of them was the most common thing that everybody knows about is Pericles' funeral speech. And what I loved about Pericles' funeral speech was that unlike all the other speeches, the funeral speeches, where he talked about the great things that people have done in the past, the big military victories that they've accomplished, their mighty army, their force, what Pericles did was basically say, what I really want to do is talk to you about what is it that made us who we are? What were the values? What were the ideals that made Athens into what it was? And he goes on this journey and explains the kind of values, particularly focusing on freedom and the importance that freedom represented to Greek culture. And one of the most important contributions for me when I look at Greek history is not just simply the freedom of the Greeks, but their love of taking risks. You know, here are these people that go on boats and ships and they go all over the world and they do their best to almost replicate their society in other places. Greece then becomes this kind of imperial nation that is really the model for empires in the West ever since then. But most important of all, in terms of taking risks, what I always remember is that moment when you know that the Persians, this mighty big empire, the Persian Empire, is going to attack Greece, Athens. And the Athenians decide to do something that's totally remarkable. They basically decide that they're going to abandon Athens. They will go on their ship and they will fight the Persians on the sea. And in this battle of Salamis, what they actually managed to do is defeat the Persians. And what's also really brilliant, what I find particularly inspiring about the Greeks, is that the people that were responsible for defeating the Persians, the most powerful empire in the area, were not these big generals, not these fancy aristocrats, but they were the ordinary sailors, the ordinary working people of Athens who took matters into their own hands and therefore quite rightly demanded democratic rights in the way that they understood it at that time. I mention this because I think one of the best things you can do if you're a parent and you got children is make them aware of the Greek experience at a very, very young age. And not only that, but it's something that if you occasionally dip into time and time again, it makes you proud to be European and it makes you proud to be who we are. The reason why we're doing this event isn't just because of my love of Greece or Katholien's love of Greece. It's simply to do with the fact that we're in the business in MCC Brussels of promoting the ideal of Europe, of promoting the cultural drivers of Europeanness and its values. And in fact, one of the things that we're doing, and I hope you put this in your diary, is in the beginning of December, in December the 3rd, for 2 days, we're going to have a conference which is basically the battle for the soul of Europe. The soul of Europe. Right? What does it mean to be European? You know, they talk a lot about European values in the EU and in the EU Commission, but they can barely spell the word value. Right? They struggle to understand what is valuable about the European experience. They're going to invent values that come out of their head, the kind of business, administrative, technocratic values, because they don't really love, they don't really understand the values that began with Greece, through Christianity, to the Roman experience, to Renaissance, all the way to Enlightenment, makes us who we are. So this is what we're about. Remember that today's discussion is the first baby step to what's going to happen later on in December, where we're going to look at some of these issues in much greater detail, because we don't just live by politics, we also live by culture. So thank you very much for coming, and we have a great panel here.
Good evening, old and new friends. Jó estét kívánok. My name is Katalin Deme. I am senior researcher at MCC Brussels, and I will be chairing this debate. For those who don't know MCC Brussels yet, MCC Brussels is a Hungarian conservative think tank. We have been founded 3 years ago, and our aim is to make impact on European policy making and European public opinion. And how we do it by initiating true in-depth debate about great issues that move our society now. This event is a special one, as Frank hasn't outlined it, because this is the 4th of the series where we collaborate with the List Institute, and where we take up timeless issues, timeless topics, which nonetheless have some connection to everyday politics and culture. The first of this event was about classical music. Maybe you remember it, how classical music is categorized as elite and excluding fringe groups and minority groups is inaccessible. Then we had an event about how the concept of beauty is being attacked and why. And the third event was about the crisis of reading. And this event is, in a way, a synthesis of the first 3 events. We will speak about the impact of Greek culture and spirit of our time. Such a complex issue. So now to the point. What is it about the ancient Greek genius that inspires generations since 2,500 years? Besides the great achievements in science and culture, it is their playfulness, creativity, willingness to break taboos, rebellion against the established hierarchies and gods, the invention of democracy, and a spirit of combat. That's important. As the Hungarian writer László Németh claimed, the Greek spirit represents futurism rather than Goethean classicism. Does it not sound as a modernist or even a progressive manifesto? Couldn't the ethos of the ancient Greeks not be the slogan of the rebellious Zoomers generation? So here is the paradox we will speak about. Why are classical studies departments in Europe and in the US facing backlash? Why is Greek mythology increasingly accused by racism, sexism, and brutality? Why is the rooting of Western civilization in ancient Greece considered too Eurocentric, even white supremacist? Why this animosity toward a civilization that is the origin of the greatest intellectual, scientific, and cultural achievements that surrounds us in our everyday life? What are the reasons of the West's loss of cultural self-awareness and blatant self-despise? And why are today's haters of Western civilization primarily intellectuals, academics, and cultural experts? These and other questions will be discussed this evening by our 3 speakers. The rules of the debate are clear and very, very simple. Each speaker has from 7 to 10 minutes to speak, sharp. Then there will be about 10 minutes or 10 minutes long discussion within the panel where the speakers, they can comment upon each other's ideas. And I will have then 3 questions to them. I will have this privilege. And then the most important part of this event, the floor is yours, dear public, dear audience. You can ask your questions. The only rule is that we speak with each other politely, and we don't ask long questions, and we are not making long comments, so that we have a dynamic and lively debate. So that was just for an introduction. And I will introduce now our first speaker, which is Benedict Beckel. Benedict Beckel is a very composite intellectual. He was born in Sweden. He studied and taught at German and French universities, lived in Italy and Namibia, yet he spent the most of his life in the US, where he feels home. He is a full-time writer and philosopher. His main areas of expertise are political philosophy, the philosophy of history, and of religion, aesthetics, and ancient Greek thought. His most recent book is Western Self-Contempt, Oikophobia, in the Decline of Civilizations. It appeared in 2022. So I am giving the word now to an American cosmopolite with roots in ancient Greece. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So so thank you for the nice introduction. And apropos of cosmopolitanism, I'm actually going to mention briefly how cosmopolitanism can also be a vector of bad ideas. But like so many other things, it's a double-edged sword. I want to make a couple of just brief points. The first point I want to make is that I think one of the premises of this whole evening is the concept of the West. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room who has heard comments, often from the left, though not exclusively from the left, to the effect that, well, the West doesn't really exist. It's really just a construct of the mind and doesn't correspond to reality. And this is, I want to make that point briefly before I move on to talk about Greece proper, which is that if this is my point, the point I want to make is that this is a rather trivial truth. So people who say this, they make the trivial claim that the West is not real in a physical sense. The West is not real in the sense that, for example, this hand is real. That's obviously true. But this kind of nominalism again being the idea that abstract concepts don't have real separate existence, they are really just names that we give to various things. One can be a nominalist, a philosophical nominalist, as I happen to be myself, and still recognize that this is an abuse of nominalism. This is taking hypernominalism too far by saying that, well, just because it's an abstract concept that doesn't have a physical existence, therefore it has nothing to do with reality. One can still look at the world and recognize several different physical particulars and see that in the aggregate, these physical particulars shape something that we can refer to as the West. And so that's something that needs to be pointed out when people are told, as they often are, that the West is just a mental invention and doesn't have any separate reality. There is a reason why Dante models himself on Virgil and not on Confucius. There is a reason why Virgil himself models himself on Homer, for example. There is a reason why we are here now speaking about ancient Greece and not about ancient China or ancient Africa. One can, of course, speak about those things as well, but they have less of a relevance to us. And since this is the MCC, I'll mention I was in Hungary for the first time last year. This year I had the privilege of being there a second time. Even when I was in Hungary the first time, there were so many things that I recognized, art, architecture, and so on, because I am a Westerner who was still in the West. I've spent, as was mentioned in the introduction, I've spent a chunk of my life in sub-Saharan Africa. I did not recognize a lot of things there because it was not the West. That's not an attack or a critique of sub-Saharan Africa. It's just to say that it is different. It is not Western. So it's important to keep these things in mind when we are told that the West is not real, that there's no such thing as the West. It certainly is something that we can concretize and talk about. And that leads me to my second point, which is that since the West does exist in this sense, since it is something that we can talk about, it stands to reason that we should see ourselves in the Greeks. They are the origin of our Western civilization. There is, of course, also the Judeo-Christian influence that comes in sort of sideways afterwards, but it begins in Greece. And if it begins in Greece, and we are Westerners as the Greeks were, or you could say the Greeks maybe were proto-Westerners, but in any case, we are Westerners like the Greeks. It's important to understand what we have in common with them. There is a tendency, and this is just like I directed my previous point against the left, maybe this particular point I would address toward conservatives who sometimes, one hears it occasionally, ascribe to ethereal equality to the past. the Greeks are sometimes raised to quasi-mythological figures who become almost unapproachable by dint of their greatness. And that, in a way, misunderstands the Greeks. It robs them of their humanity. We have to understand, and this will help us understand our own problems, our own predicaments today, we have to understand that the Greeks went through so many of the same problems as we go through. So many of the signs of social decadence that conservatives often complain about today, the Greeks went through as well. You can mention oikophobia, which the book that I wrote about, that Catalin mentioned, cultural self-hatred. One can mention androgyny, moral relativism, atheism. The Greeks went through all of these things. Not always with the same details and to the same extent as today, of course, but mutatis mutandis, the Greeks went through these problems. And so by looking at what they went through, and why they went through those things, we come to understand our own predicaments. So this is especially, I'm talking about partly the generation of Socrates, but especially the generation after Socrates. One can mention several names like Antiphon the Sophist, Alcidamas, Hippias of Elis, Antisthenes, Diogenes the Cynic, etc. The list goes on. And by understanding how they were a part of a moving civilization, of their Greek civilization towards self-hatred, we understand what happens today. The idea, for example, of relativism, of moral relativism, the struggle between, the debate between physis, nature, and nomos, law or convention, was very strong, was very much in vogue in late 5th century and early 4th century BC Athens. Isocrates in the mid-4th century complains about no one believing in the ancient Greek gods anymore. Plato, in the last book of his Nomoi, the Laws, complains that there are many atheists around. So by looking carefully at what the Greeks, not only at their great achievements, which of course are legion, but also at their problems, we really see ourselves. And this leads me to my final point, which I'll conclude with, which is that when we posit the Greeks as the origins of the West, and this goes a little bit to the speech we heard right in the beginning, we are accused of Eurocentrism. And this is another remark that I would also direct toward conservatives. One often hears conservatives be rather squeamish when we are accused of Eurocentrism, as if Eurocentrism were the same thing as racism, which it certainly is not. And they try to find excuses for it and said, well, other cultures are also really beautiful and so on, and that's fine, but we should be proud of our Eurocentrism. We should be proud of the fact that we are inheritors of the Greeks, because we not only have their problems, we have some of their triumphs and successes as well. And when we are able to embrace a positive vision of what it means to be European, I mean, I'm from the United States mainly, but I consider America a part of that. Of course, we are inheritors of the European tradition in the United States as well. When we understand what a privilege it is to be part of the European tradition, then that's how we are able to inspire people, because it's not enough to react against social decadence. It's not enough to react against cultural self-hatred. One also has to embrace something positive. And that's really what's going to make a difference, what's going to make a difference on the next generation, to embrace something positive. So when we look at the Greeks, to make a final point, that doesn't mean, of course, that, for example, an African can't be Afrocentric, or that a Chinese person can't be Sinocentric, or what have you. That's fine. They often are. But we should be proud of the fact that we are inheritors of Greece and that we are Eurocentric. And so when we look at the Greeks, we see nobility and turpitude. We see virtue and depredation. And by looking at them, we learn to understand ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Benedict. Now we are moving from Western oikophobia to the critique of religion and the reinterpretation of traditions. Our second guest is Professor Mert. He is from BUB. He teaches at Classical Studies Department, and he is very much engaged in the discourse of atheism and the critique of religion and how we interpret religion in a free society today. So I'm giving you the word, Professor Mert, and you can elaborate about the question.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening. Well, I wish to approach the main topic from the perspective of ancient Greek philosophy. and how that can be used as a sort of coping mechanism with modern challenges. Well, I started by looking at a famous work by Charles Taylor, A Secular Age, where he, in this chapter, he describes the malaises of modernity. And he says that the last 2 centuries have been characterized by unbelief and secularity, and that has become an alternative of the Christian faith. And he also mentions what he calls a Nova effect. So it began with the elites and it became more generalized to the masses in the second half of the 20th century. And basically, since last 2 centuries, he calls it an anthropocentric invulnerability. So everything is everything can be explained by means of reason and science, but at the same time, that excludes all the, let's say, the transcendental, because everything has to fit that rational paradigm or framework. So any sense of wonder or, let's say, awe is excluded, and that requires also new forms of meaning and spirituality. And the problem is that if you, from a secular point of view, it's very difficult to find meaning and spirituality. There were already early attempts during the French Revolution. You had, let's say, le culte de la raison, where you had sort of patroness who was in a sort of ritual carried around and with ideas loosely based on Diderot and Voltaire. But you also had le culte de l'être suprême, that was from Robespierre, that was more deist, so that already had a form of transcendental idea, but still it was short-lived, both those attempts, because it's very difficult to find meaning if you're disconnected from the metaphysical world. And therefore, ancient Greek philosophy can be an alternative, because it recognizes the physical world, but the metaphysical world as well. So you have room for, let's say, more transcendental, more spirituality, mysticism. It has room for that. But there are also other reasons why ancient Greek philosophy is, let's say, a tool that can be used for all sorts of modern challenges. For example, what I would say, it's a critical voice, and I would call that a signalizer, because it's able to detect, identify, and confront forms of social polarization. Well, Benedict mentioned the idea of physis and nomos in the 5th century BC. Well, what Greek philosophy also does is it looks for balance. And it's very aware of extremes, outliers that can form in society. Well, and you have late 5th century BC, you had the situation in Athens of the plague during the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. And Thucydides reports that there is a sort of relativism, moral relativism. People, they become infected with the plague, they die, they see that it has no meaning, that it's no use to uphold all religious rituals, because good people as well as bad people die, so there's no difference between that. So it becomes a sort of moral relativism, nihilism, and then you see that that philosophy will critique that, and you see critiques that if physis becomes more dominant than nomos, then you see that certain intellectuals, Greek philosophers, will react to that. Famous is in Plato's Republic, you have the story of the ring of Gyges. And it's a story told by Plato's brother Glaucon. He says it's about a shepherd, Gyges, who finds a ring, a magical ring, and it enables him to become invisible. So he has a means to, let's say, to alter physis, and then that allows him to escape the constraints of nomos. The ring enables him to become invisible, so he can first he plays all sort of practical jokes, but then it becomes more criminal. He seduces the queen, he kills the king of Lydia, and he marries the queen. And the moral of the story is when nomos becomes less important than physis, people will always create a criminal mindset. But at the same time, Socrates responds to that, and he says, no, there will always be people who will uphold nomos, even if they have a means to alter physis. Well, it's actually, and here you see also another tenet of Greek philosophy, it's the debate, it's the open discussion. And that's another valuable tenet of Greek philosophy, I believe, that it's the use of logic. So instead of, let's say, feelings, emotions, that nowadays in most of these contemporary political ideologies and theories, it's mostly based on how people feel. And that's something that ancient Greek philosophy tries to counter with promoting the use of logic. Open dialogue, dialectic method. Also, what you see with most political theories and ideologies, that they're convinced of their absolute truth. Let's say cultural Marxism or critical race theory, they all see everything in terms of absolute truth. They are right, and who denies or who objects their ideas are wrong. So there's no room for debate. There's no room for, let's say, changing your opinions. And that is what an important tenet of ancient Greek philosophy. There was room for debate. There was an open discussion, and there was also room for personal growth. And so you had to learn your whole life. You could never tell, I have finished everything that I needed to know about wisdom. That was never achieved. Socrates said that he knew much less than what he actually knew, so that he was actually ignorant, and he tried to learn. And I think that's also important. It's a lifelong process of learning that's promoted by ancient Greek philosophy. And also what I would call the avoidance of extremes, outliers. Also finding balance in society. When society is, for example, when nomos becomes less important than physis, or physis becomes less important than nomos. There's also in the 5th century BC a view that Athens is not becoming or is characterized by religious relativism or nihilism, but it's actually religious fanaticism. For example, you have all sorts of the Diopetes decree, Anaxagoras who is persecuted. You have the Acebeia trials, people who are accused of Acebeia, impiety, and you have, of course, the trial of Socrates. One of the accusations was that he was introducing new gods, so he was acting against the state religion of Athens. So you see all these forms of outliers in society, and that is where ancient Greek philosophy warns us about. You have these famous types of government by Aristotle, the good forms of government, that's monarchy, aristocracy, constitutional democracy, but you have the outliers, so the extreme forms that you have to avoid. That's tyranny, of course, when it relates to monarchy. You have oligarchy when it relates to aristocracy, and you have radical democracy. Ochlocracy is actually the term which means mob rule. So that's are the outliers. So philosophy points out is like a sort of conscious for ancient Greek society, but can also be our conscience nowadays for all sorts of theories which tend to be extreme. And you have this in academia. I saw a podcast recently of Victor Davis Hanson, a famous classical scholar, and he mentions that that the students, of course he speaks of the American situation, that students are not so well trained in Greek and Latin anymore. They are becoming more theorists. They're more interested in political theory, and that becomes more important than actually learning about Latin and Greek. So he says it's more important nowadays to become an autodidact. So universities, we have the idea it's more like an indoctrination. It's not about an education that you receive there. But that's the American situation. I don't think it's that extreme here in Europe. But in any case, it's the tenets that I would mention that are very important in about Greek philosophies, the connection between the physical and the metaphysical world. It's a critical voice for social polarization. It's intellectual honesty. It's based on open debate, use of logic, dialectic method. There is personal growth, so you have the individual freedom to develop on your own pace throughout your lifetime. So you're not limited to universities, let's say, the aspect of the autodidact. There is the sense of finding balance in society, and there's the avoidance of extremes and outliers.
Wonderful. Thank you for this very, very interesting discourse. So now we are going to move from the interplay between nomos and physis and the magic and transcendence in Greek philosophy and Greek culture to my good colleague Maren. Maren, she is senior researcher fellow at MCC Brussels, Maren Thom. She has been working in academia for many years, and she unpicks very often the knotted ties between politics, culture, and cinema. She will be speaking about cinema, and co-hosts Performance Anxiety. This is a podcast that dissects contemporary performances and tells you why you are wrong about everything. Her writing has appeared in Spiked, Compact and Cafe, American, exploring how film and culture shape and misshape our political moment. So please, Maren, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katalin. Thank you very much. So what I want to put to you today is that the people who want to censor the Greeks do not do so because of what's in the Greek classic. I mean, there's lots of weird stuff in there. I mean, you've probably read some of it or heard some of it. I don't think it's the content necessarily, but it's because of how they work, especially Greek drama. It's how drama works on you as a spectator. That is the problem for them. So, because the way drama works is through trauma, great Greek worked here. So it confronts you with conflict and contradiction that changes you as a spectator. Contemporary censors do not like this. They do not like the fact that something might confront you or traumatize you or leave you with unresolved feelings. And this is also important because it's how drama still works today. Whether it's TV, film, theater, drama works now because of what the ancient Greeks did. So if you're a censor and you have a problem with contemporary drama, it makes quite good sense to go back to the Greeks. If you can nullify the Greek, you're cutting the legs from under the contemporary drama as well. So, in short, the desire to sanitize today's, culture is really an attempt to uproot the very mechanism of drama itself, to strip it of its power, to disturb, transform, and to, most of all, I think, remake the audience. So, I mean, how did the Greeks invent drama? What they did, they made storytelling, which existed all over the world, but what they did, they made it into an act of how to be a citizen. You had to, drama became a way of being a citizen. So they put on ritual on a public square, put it in costumes, put music to it, and put competitions out to it. Great innovator in the 6th century BC was a guy called Thespis. He stepped out of the chorus and started talking to the audience in character. Crazy guy. Of course, we get out the word thespian from this. And so it developed. Aeschylus added a second actor, Sophocles added a third actor, and then it went on and on. Euripides just gave them really complex things to think about and talk about, and made them also quite politically dangerous, I must say. Athenians built theaters that held thousands of people, and they paid poor citizens to go into the theater and watch the drama. Because drama was not a private diversion. It was your public duty to be exposed to drama. It was civic, and it was, most importantly, it was transformative. And transformation is the key. It's so important that Aristotle gave it a name, and he called it catharsis. Aristotle said, the poet should produce the pleasure, which comes from pity and fear, and should do so by means of imitation. This imitation was called mimesis, mimic, the staging of action in front of an audience, and thus this turned drama into a machine for transformation. Aristotle said that plot, or mythos, is the soul of tragedy. And we know this. Plot is the weaving together of different events into a structure that feels inevitable, but it's also surprising. Yeah, so we have things like recognition, or the reversal, peripeteia, the plot twist. Yeah, without anything, we can't imagine anything without a plot twist. But this would jolt the audience into pity and fear. We have characters, ethos, yeah, where we have a point of identification. We have archetypal figures like Oedipus the king, Antigone the defiant, or Medea the furious mother. Excuse me. And all of this, I mean, all this kind of identification through trauma is what censors don't like. They don't like the fact that drama destabilizes us and leaves us altered. Now, as I said, the other part of the problem is that how drama works still today, and it's interesting to see that contemporary censors are not trying to suppress specific ideas that they think are dangerous, heretical, or whatever. Contemporary censors are trying to control and manage our emotional response to things. So, and I think the best example that I think you all know is the Pixar movies. Yeah, this is, we all know the story of, Toy Story and Inside Out and Up. And, hang on, this is a bit scratchy. And it's not an accident, because Pixar used to be the closest thing that cinema had to the Aristotelian tragic machine, because they're writers. They were given a story handbook. You can look it up online, the Pixar Story Handbook. And it's basically a rewrite of Aristotle's Poetics. It's just crib notes. So this is how the writers of these movies were given this to write. This is how you do a plot. And we all know, we've seen Up, and you go through the trauma of losing somebody in the first 10 minutes, and it is devastating. And you go through the catharsis with the main character, Carl. Or in Inside Out, when all the emotions that take place in this kid's head. And you are with the character Joy, who's the main character, and she has to accept that sadness is nothing to overcome, but it's part of, the trauma that we have to experience to grow up. Growing up is nothing but a series of traumas. And without these traumas, there is no growth. It's a great, great film. The problem is, like 5-6 years ago, they ripped this up. They didn't do it anymore. I mean, can you remember any of the Pixar films from the last 5 years? Likelier, nobody saw that. Basically, that was the continuation of Toy Story, but it was basically the affirmation of identities. There's nothing in there. There's no plot twist. There's no catharsis. Nobody feels bad. There's nothing that jolts you. It's rather representation and affirmation. No catharsis whatsoever. Similar with all the rest of the Pixar films. Completely devoid of story, devoid of plot. It's just reaffirmation. They're technically quite good, but honestly, I would ask anybody who went to see them, you will not remember because you have no emotional journey. You don't go through any kind of catharsis with any of these films. So that was basically my point. So contemporary censors are not interested in the past. They're interested in the present. They want to control how you feel, and they want to control the fact that you do not have an emotional response to things, because that could change the way you think, the way you think about something. It could make you feel unpleasant. Yeah, we don't want that. So there is this kind of horrible flattening of content in the arts, and that is the reason. We always talk about, it's a wokeification of something, but what is it? And that's what it is. You're taking the Aristotelian storytelling out of the drama, right? And that's what makes it boring. It's not just because it's woke. The wokeness is not the problem. It's the fact that you cancel the techniques of storytelling. And yeah, where does that lead us? Boring culture. Well, that was me. Evaristo.
Thank you. Dear presenters, now we have our precious 10 minutes where we can discuss in the panel. And I would ask first Benedict whether you have some comments on Maren's and Alexander's presentations. If you have, then you have the liberty to present it.
Thank you. If it's a debate format, I suppose I'm supposed to say something critical, but I find myself in agreement, no, not surprisingly, with what was said. What you said, of course, is a little closer to my remarks in terms of physis and nomos and so on. I think it's interesting. We were speaking before a little bit on the sidelines there about how atheism then disappears after this time period that we were talking about, I think I guess it's not much of a question. I guess it's just an additional thought that I'm adding, is that I think it's interesting to see how the measure of the advancement of a civilization, quote-unquote advancement of a civilization, is what leads to these issues. And that's the paradox of some of the things that we're talking about here, how the more advanced, the more progressed a Western society becomes, and we see this among the Greeks, the more these problems that we complain about arise, which is the paradox really of social decline, is that the social decline comes from social success. And that's something that we recognize today as well, just as we see it among the Greeks. That's what I would add. But I, of course, appreciated very much your talk as well. And I like especially your point again. Am I supposed to disagree? I'm really just agreeing. Yeah, exactly. So you're saying how I love the fact, your point about how it's not so much the wokeism as the fact that they are abandoning the Aristotelian paradigm, which is a really interesting point as well that I haven't looked at it in that precise way before. So thank you for saying that. Yeah.
Thank you. Benedict, my question to you is, when we discuss Western self-hatred, we are severing our roots from our cultural and historical origins. We rightly mostly blame the left, the Vokes. But does it exist such thing as a right-wing oikophobia,
yes.
conservative oikophobia? Could you describe the
there
phenomenon?
is. So it's not the genuine article, if you will, in the sense that the regular left-wing, or left-wing doesn't make as much sense, that term, for the ancient world. It makes more sense to speak of conservative and progressive, but I'll use the word progressive. But the progressive oikophobia is the original oikophobia, if you will. But then, yes, and this also happens in ancient Greece, incidentally. And it happens in every society in which we see oikophobia, namely that there is then a conservative reaction against oikophobia, which we then can call reactionary oikophobia. And that is what happens when conservatives see what has happened to their society, and they perceive that their society has become decadent and slothful and so on, and so they begin to hate their own society for that reason, hearkening back to a golden past, which wasn't always so golden, but that's the idea anyway. And we see this again. I mean, Plato, in fact, we mentioned in the original speech, the Battle of Salamis was mentioned, the fact that it was won by the simple Athenian oarsmen. Yes, and that's why Plato does not like the Battle of Salamis, because he feels that this made the lower classes a little too uppity and started to question the traditions of Athens and so on. We see this kind of reactionary oikophobia come again in Rome. A good example of that is Juvenal, for example, who complains about what has happened to his beloved Rome. I'm not saying, I mean, I love Juvenal, so it's possible to, and obviously, I don't love Plato, but I respect Plato. But so it's possible to appreciate the work of these gentlemen and nonetheless recognize that there is a reactionary oikophobic element there. In modern times, Nietzsche would be a good example, especially in his later work, how he absolutely hates Germany because of what he perceives the German lands have become. So that does certainly happen, yes. And we see it today in the United States and in Western and Northern Europe as well.
This is very interesting. I guess we will discuss this topic further in the discussion with the public. A question to you, Alexander. You're coming rightly from Belgian academia, which is really very interesting for us. So you are a messenger in a way. I would like to ask you whether you experience some tensions in your classes, some critique of ancient Greece as misogynic, as racist, as anti-feminist, and so on, or if you have some concrete experiences. And I just want to mention to you that in 2024, the University of Exeter released some new rules about how to self-censorship during teaching, where Homer's Iliad and Odyssey was called distressing for students. They got some trigger warnings, so don't read it, or if you read, or you shouldn't come to the class. And the newest development is really, really new, that two German historians from the University of Oldenburg created a funny response to this phenomenon in the university, in the classroom. And they wrote a new history of ancient Greece, where the introduction is the following. This book may contain traces of violence, sexual content, profanity, and political incorrectness of all kind, but it is guaranteed to be sugar and calorie-free. It must not fall into the hands of children or visitors to humanistic high schools. Reading this book may be disturbing. For further risk and side effects, please consult your doctor, pharmacist, whoever you want. So we really arrived at an absurdity that we should serve ancient Greek history and pack it in, in a way that nobody would feel disturbed and offended. So what do you think about this phenomenon?
Well, I think that's a slippery slope, I would say, because that's the first stage, but the second stage is probably censorship, that they will say, well, we have to edit redact certain passages from classics because they may seem harmful or distressful for some readers. So I don't think that, well, the explanation that they give is, yeah, because some students have traumatic experiences so that they can relive them through reading. But that's not the task of academics. We cannot, well, name me one human culture in history that was utopian and that was all without wars or bloodshed. That's impossible. So I don't think that those trigger warnings will. That's not a good idea, because how could you develop into critical thinkers if, first of all, you don't have access to the whole story, to the whole sources? Because, well, trigger warnings, they can say, well, this sort of disclaimer, but I see this as a stepstone towards censorship. And that's something that the Greeks would very much would be against, because you had isegoria, freedom of speech. You had eleutheria, freedom, and you had also paresia, that is outspokenness. So it was there were Greek principles to be blunt in their sources, and if that becomes problematic for let's say today's students, then you're just going to give a version of antiquity that does not respond to the historical reality. I think this whole problem is related to what I would call the ethic approach and the emic approach. The ethic approach is that you look at the past from the perspective of the outsider, the modern observer, and then there can be a tendency to incorporate modern ideas, theories, and transfer to the past. That's, for example, how Karl Popper accused Plato of being a fascist, how Benjamin Isaac, who wrote a famous book on racism in antiquity, called Aristotle a proto-racist because his view on barbarians, but that was actually a view because he said, yeah, you have barbarians in the north and there's too cold, so and you have in Africa it's too hot, so the Greeks live in a moderate climate and they're excellent, and that reflects in their thought, in their ideas. So it's absurd to think that the ancient Greeks, or accuse them of all sorts of modern theories of ideas that they were not aware of. So you have to apply the emic approach, and the emic approach is the viewpoint from the insider. So you look at the historical actors themselves, what were their mentalities, what were their ideas. So that gives you the opportunity to reconstruct the past, and the ethic approach is more a way to reimagine the past, how you wish it to be. But that's very dangerous if you altering the past. So then you come up with a construct that actually more resembles the zeitgeist that you live in than it actually gives you a representation, a plausible representation of historical truth, of historical reality.
Thank you. Just a last question to you, a very short question. You have been teaching at the Free University of Brussels. Do you see some new patterns in the approach of your students to the ancient Greeks?
Well, there is some sense, a bit of more sensitive. If you use certain terms, it's a coincidence. But this week I was explaining how we were going to conduct a seminar this year, and I was speaking. I don't know how it came up, but the Severi, the Roman emperors who were of Berber origin. And there was a student, and he opposed. He said, "That's not a right term, Berber. That's an offensive term. You have to use." And he mentioned an Arabic. So a bit like Eskimo, Inuit, you could compare. So I was not aware of that. But say, yeah, Berber, that refers to barbarian. and that's inappropriate. So you have these sensitive ideas, but it's more sporadic, I must say. But what you also see is that students are interested in when they have to do a thesis, that they like doing research like racism in antiquity, what were the ideas, how were the views on race in antiquity. There's also a lot of interest for marginalized groups, let's say do topics about slaves, freedmen, so all, let's say, the groups who have traditionally been viewed as having very little forms of agency, and the idea that the sources, the ancient sources, are elitist, they are composed by the elite, so they do not mention all those social inferior groups that they in their writings. So the students are, well, that's, I think, a new tendency, that they are interested in those marginalized groups, prostitution, slaves, say freedmen, xenoi, the peregrini, the foreigners, how they were integrated into Roman society or Greek society, the metics, so all those groups in Athens who had very few means of participation in political institutions, and etc.
Thank you. And Maren, my humble question to you is, you just presented that the film and the arts and drama should be transformative, should bring catharsis. But how do you dissect propaganda in film and the transformative part of it? Where is the line, the divisive line between being transformative and starting with propaganda?
Well, there is no line. You know, drama is powerful, and the people who recognized this were, of course, the ideologues first of all. You know, look at from Goering to you know the trains that went through Russia and propagated the Russian Revolution. They knew how powerful cinema was. They knew how powerful storytelling was. They knew how this worked, and that's the power, and the Greeks knew it. This is why you had to go and be part of your being a citizen, was to be able to watch this and be able to bear this. You can go through trauma and survive. And that's what the difference is. It's not that. So the problem is with people who say you cannot cope with trauma. Yeah, that's where the kind of censorship sets in. The people who say, yeah, this is all very good, but make it nice. This is we cannot make things nice. Things are traumatic, and the great thing about drama and art is you can go through trauma without having to do it for real. Yeah, you can watch a horror movie and be running for your life, but you're going to be safe in your seat. You can watch a film when you're little. Everybody watched things like Taka the Otter, or you go through trauma of loss and you cry, but you don't really have to lose somebody. So you can go. These things are there for you to experience trauma and how you grow from it. So it's a safe way of growing up and becoming a new person. And that's what the Greeks realized.
Thank you. So now I open the floor for the discussion in the public. And first, it is Frank Furedi, who can speak in the microphone and
thank
react.
you. I've got a question for the first two speakers especially, which is, I always think there's a danger of anachronism when we're looking at Greece and of reading history backwards and seeing what happens in Greece as a precursor of what's going on now, even though the historical periods are very different. The question I have is this. I mean, I don't know nearly as much as you guys, But as far as I understand it, in ancient Greek, there is no word for religion. Right? And I think there's a very good reason why there's no word for religion, because for the Greeks, religion had no meaning like it does today or in modern times. It was something that was all-encompassing, and they had gods, but they didn't have any religion, because what we call, or I call, religious was a series of rituals and worship and cultural accomplishments which were integrated into the community. So I think it's quite important that we don't, sort of just jump backwards and extract from Greece something that may have been very different. And similarly, again, you probably know this better than I do, the word for atheism in ancient Greek has a different meaning than atheism means today, because it basically meant piety. And Socrates himself, when he was charged with this, was charged for being impious, for not, in a sense, recognizing the customs and appreciating the customs of Greece. So the question I have is basically on this specific point, but to what extent is it legitimate to take the experience of Greece and then just simply read into it our own problems? Because then it may well be the case that we reinvent a past that is very much due to our own imagination rather than what really happened.
So it's a good question. So it depends a little bit about what part of Greece we're talking about. So asabeia, the lack of piety or impiety. But the word atheos actually does appear a bit later, someone who is without God. And so there is, so it depends which era of Greece we are referring to, but the atheism as a concept does in fact appear, although, yes, more it comes more in the Hellenistic era. What the question really opens a pretty big can of worms, which I love. And this is, I think you mentioned Karl Popper. Karl Popper is very much in this vein that we can't really read back into things. We can't see these kinds of patterns in history because that he simply says that's not how history works. He rejects human nature as a motivating force in history, and feels that we cannot draw these analogies as you imply in your question. So I think that Karl Popper is very much wrong, and it's something I've written fairly extensively about, which is basically that you cannot say, so I'm trying to make this as brief as possible, but basically any assumption that you make about history is an assumption. That is to say, there's no quote-unquote baseline view of history. If you say that history, that we cannot make these kinds of analogies in history or read into the past what we are experiencing today, that is as much of an imposition on history as saying that we can do those things. Because the implication of the former statement would be that there is a quote-unquote pure history that exists and that we have to capture. But that is not history. History is simply what we make based on historical artifacts, based on textual and material remains. And so anything we say about quote-unquote history is already an imposition. My point being that it is just as legitimate to say that we can read these things into history as to say that we cannot read these things into history. And so ultimately it boils down to a search for evidence. And if we do look for the evidence, then we have to see in the particular case, okay, what does the evidence suggest in this particular case? We have to perform that search for evidence without these preconditions that either analogies are possible or that analogies are not possible. And in this particular case, when it comes to atheism, and this is something that I've tried to lay out in some of my writing, those analogies are there. I mean, I'm not the only one who's talked about this, but those analogies are there, and the Greeks do, in fact, talk about the loss of faith in God. It is not just the collapse of ceremony or that people don't really believe in. People start to question the purpose of animal sacrifice to the gods and so on. That happens as well, but there is, in fact, also the idea, again, it depends a little bit about what era we're talking about, but we also do have what we would call genuine atheism today. So based on the evidence, I think such analogies are certainly possible.
Please, the gentleman in the fourth row.
I'd like to ask a question about Greeks and barbarians. As far as I remember, in ancient Egypt, an Egyptian was one who lived in Egypt and thus ate from the river Nile, who lived by Egyptian customs and who honored the Egyptian gods, and that was it. Whether he had fair hair, funny nose, or whatever. They had a dynasty of pharaohs from the Fourth Cataract. They were sub-Saharians. They had the Greek dynasty. They had all different dynasties, but the essence was they were all Egyptians because they did these three conditions. And I remember the same thing in Greece. A Greek is someone who speaks Greek, that's it. And he may have a funny nose or whatever. And as far as I understand, that's what civilization is. Become someone of ours. And present homophobia says, no, you have to handle all different things and you cannot do as the others and the others are more important than you. Well, if you think so, go to your home because this is ours.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Kathleen, otherwise we run out of time. Can we take a group of questions,
yes, please?
Who else wanted to speak?
Thank you. I'm Irene Dimopoulou and I'm a political advisor, so I'd like to land the discussion to the political field. This is something that we have been experiencing in the EU just before the Lisbon Treaty. And this is something that has been happening for the past 20 years, the regression of classical Greek and Latin in our schools. And the results are some things that we already experience. But in the political field, we experience that in the concept of democracy itself, because in ancient Greece, democracy was part of what you mentioned as a transcendental experience. Democracy was put into place in order to help the individual grow and move from the position between God and animal, and through reincarnation, grow into a being that is conscious in the philosophical sense. So, to offer an answer to the question of today's colloque, in order to be able to find out who does not want the Greeks and the Greek spirit, we must look at who does not want philosophy to be part of our education, and that's the different theocracies in my point of view. And also, it might be an answer to go back to the poetics, which is the peeing, the making, the initiative of the European nations to make again, instead of being followers of the different trends in thinking. Thank you
very much. Thank you very much. And the next, and there is in the back.
David Price. I've written a little bit on different sections of history, but Greece, as far as I'm concerned, is not just Athens. We had Alexander the Great, who was a Macedonian, and then we had Sparta. And Sparta is also interesting for me because the historians of the early centuries linked it with the Israelite tribes and said there was actually a relationship. And when I was doing some research, it's quite clear from the writers of the first century that the Israelites were actually very, very populous. They weren't just the Jews, but there was the Israelite tribes, which went from Mesopotamia all the way to France in the area. So I'm a bit, I would take odds with the phrase, the Judeo-Christian civilization was sidelined part of the Greek civilization. That's not true, because Josephus wrote in Greek, Philo of Alexandria wrote in Greece, and they both said the most populous nation on earth was the Israelites. This is in the first century. So the Israelite civilization went from the end of the second century, the first millennium, and put the values of modern Europe very strongly, much more than the dysfunctional gods who had the most horrendous histories. And I would just like to say on the last section, which is the subject of your book about self-hate, the Christian philosophy has a phrase which is, you should love your neighbor as yourself, which means you should love yourself and know what loving yourself is before you deal with anything else. And we, as a Western civilization, should be able to love ourselves a little bit more.
May I comment briefly there?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Yes, so I don't actually think there's any contradiction between what you said and my previous remarks. So first of all, I mean, your last point, as Rav Hillel also says, if you don't care about yourself, who will? So I entirely agree. When it comes to your first point, the individuals to whom you refer, they are all in the Hellenistic period. They're much later. What I'm talking about when I was talking about Greece as the origin is many hundred years before that, really referring to late archaic and then especially, of course, the heyday of the classical era, many hundred years before Josephus and so on. So I don't think there is any contradiction between your point and mine.
Please. Tony, in the first row.
Thank you for this very interesting panel again. Thank you for bringing this together. My question is the following. I'm coming from the military, so we have all this Greek stuff already known. And now we see drones, and the point that I'm going to make is the following. As now we have no knowledge about how we should shoot them down. If I'm afraid from the Greeks, that means you don't know the Greeks. So my question is, as it was answered around me already, what are we going to do about it? Because we can talk about it here in a small group, but in Europe, obviously, it's no longer part of our identity. It's no longer part of, as you said, when I'm in Europe, I walk around, I see around and do this. So how can we make that impact to get that back so that we understand that we are going backwards in our society, backwards in our culture, backwards in our identity? And how can we make that the Greeks are loved again so that we can learn something from the past?
Thank you very much. And now there are two questions in the back also. The microphone is going there, and then we have collected the questions, and you can try to answer on some of them.
Oh, was I supposed to wait? I'm sorry.
Nice.
So it was that many of the problems which ancient Greeks were facing were similar to some problems which we still face today. So my question is, what was the attitude toward and discussion going around in ancient Greek society surrounding the concept of free speech?
Just a quick question. I wondered if the panel could speak a little bit more about the strangeness of ancient Greece rather than trying to kind of pose it in modern terms a bit more. And I'm always, in this kind of discussion, reminded of there was recent translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey by an academic called Emily Wilson, which were very much feted in the public press and the popular press as being wonderful, rich, very modern, evocative translations. And she opens the Odyssey with "Sing to me about a complicated man." And there are various other translations. Don't read or speak Greek, but I've read plenty of other translations of it, and they all have very, very different approaches to it. But that phrase, "sing to me of a complicated man," seemed to really sum up so much of the desire to make the Greeks speak our own words, to make them sound almost like teenagers in the street. Oh, he's so complicated. It's such a complicated situation. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what makes the Greeks so strange, because it seems to me rather than talking about how they're so much like us and we can learn from them in that way, it seems actually we've got more to learn from thinking about how they were different from us, how their concepts of masculinity were so different from us, how their attitude to risk and adventure and war were kind of so alien to the way we think about it. So I'd like the panel to reflect a little bit on the strangeness of the Greeks, not on how they're just like us.
Very well. There is one last question in the back, and then we start to...
Thank you. Good evening. Just with all fairness to Frank, just a point, the Greeks also had a different definition of gods, the theoi, who were athanatos, which is different from ours. Just if it comes, Jacob's point about the Greeks are strange if you know Greek and you actually read their tragedies, but your points are well taken. If we would boil it down and we look at the Greek words we still use today, so ethics versus customs, chronology, and the idea of abstraction, is that what the Greeks kind of boiled down to or should inspire us with today? Thank you.
Very well. To give you, Alexandre, the word, you can also react on Frank's question or pick up the questions that are most relevant for you.
Yes, I don't have an overview anymore of the different questions, so well, there was this question about Atheos in the beginning. That the Greeks didn't have a word for religion, that's true. It was more a matter of orthopraxis. So you have to perform rituals, and it was a matter of visibility. So when one of the accusations of Socrates is that he didn't perform divination, that means that they didn't see him do it. So it was a very visible thing to perform the ritual. So they didn't know what you thought of in your head, so they didn't really have a sort of, let's say, a cognitive idea of religion. It was more a pragmatical idea. You had to perform rituals, you had to you make use of hymns or your prayers or libations, so all visible aspects of let's say religious behavior, ritual behavior. And also atheos, of course, it's a term that has had different semantic shifts throughout its occurrence in ancient sources. I think the oldest occurrence is by Bacchylides, a poet, and there it means to be forsaken by the gods. So it's actually it applies to a myth that he recounts. When your behavior is let's say, criminal, then the gods no longer protect you. And then you are atheos, you are abandoned by the gods. And then you are wandering across the land completely on your own. So it's also related to misotheos. That's a synonym, but that's already early and no longer in use. And then it develops in a more general sense. It becomes more like being disrespectful to parents, cruel to parents, and then it gradually becomes godless. And then, but godless is still abstract, and I think it's around, if I'm not mistaken, around 400 BC that it actually first time gets the meaning of not believing in the gods. And then it goes further. Plato comes up with a noun, atheotes, he coins. That's godlessness, and then it means not believing in the gods. And you have in book 10 of the laws, you have his classification of atheists, and the first are the radical atheists, that's the first group. Then you have the deists, those who believe that the God exists, but they do not interfere in human life. Yes. And the third category is the traditional theists. So he also condemns traditional believers, mostly because when they have like private altars and they lure people into sacrifice on their altar so they can charge them. And that's something that, because Plato has a vision of religion has to be public, as a public character, it has to be taken away from the private sphere, because then you get all these forms of excesses and forms of corrupt behavior, that people take advantage of the gods, and they think that the god, as he says, it's literally, they believe that the gods can be bribed by prayers, so that the gods are foolish, that they fall for your false, insincere form of piety. So it's a very complicated evolution of atheos by Plutarch. When you come in the treatise on superstition by Plutarch, that's around 100 AD, then it's not believing in divine providence. Then it has a more specific. So you see, it's shifting, and it's like Benedict said, it really depends on the period, the time frame where you must place atheos to have a correct interpretation of the term. So.
Maren, what would you say on Jacob's question about this complex, strange Greek character? How can the Netflix series reflect upon it or revive them, bring them to life? As a cruel, heroic, loyal, and so on, very composite, very human.
Yeah, so, you know, as we established, the Greeks were very strange, weren't they? They, you know, slaves everywhere, and, you know, things that we just can't fathom today. You know, weird stuff happening left, right, and center, weird language. But that's, but we're not scholars. Well, there, I'm not, in terms of Greek. But so what we actually want is to understand, we want to be as human as them. And so the point of Greece is that they developed a kind of grammar that still works for us today in terms of culture, politics, ideas, thinking about philosophy, just thinking generally, critical thinking. So this is what we, you know, recognize. So I don't know, if we want to make a drama about the Greeks, anything what we do interpretive-wise is never about the Greeks or the past. It's about us now. This is why these new translations sound of now, because they speak to, it's about us now. They're deliberately written this way. They're not written in a way that it's for the Greeks who died 2,000 years ago. You know, it's for us. And any kind of nice depiction of the Greeks. Maybe Kirk Douglas in the 60s was a film about the 60s. You know, Stanley Kubrick made a film about the Vietnam War. Yeah, so this is what Spartacus is really about. Contemporary films about the Greeks, I don't know, in the 90s we had the lovely Troy thing, which was just all about kind of big cinema. Now we have got all these kind of woke interpretations of, you know, showing us Greek history, because that's the times we live in. So every depiction of the past, every interpretation of the past is not about the past, it's about us now.
Benedict and Alexander, you are a philosopher, but now try to come out from your comfort zone. What do you think about the Netflix series? Can they bring youth and society closer to the Greek genius or the phenomenon? Can they bring up this complexity? Do we need the complexity? Is it good we have these great series about Alexander the Great and Spartacus? And that would be one question. And how would you compare them, Alexandra, for example, with the filmatizations of the 1960s, the black-white films about the same era? Were they better? Was there more catharsis, the potential for catharsis in these filmatizations? So just shoot on Maren.
Okay, so I think there is a film version of Quo Vadis. It's not in 1912. Well, it's a very early version. I think 1912, Quo Vadis. It's more sort of, let's say, mass scenes that you have. So I think that they take the topic of Quo Vadis, so the Christian theme, and also the Christians who are being persecuted and who are condemned to the Colosseum, but it's more I think that movie is more about the technical capabilities of the time that they could. It's as I'm not mistaken, the first film with mass scenes, with a lot of figurants, and I think that was a way to make a spectacle, to make. And then you have, like in the 50s, you have Ben-Hur, and you have also the 50s version of Quo Vadis. It's also with a lot of landscapes that or that they have reenacted all these buildings. So I think that it's more a sense of what the and Technicolor, in Technicolor, of course, the display of the technical possibilities of that time. Not so, and they used antiquity as a way to, because Rome had the large plains, let's say the arenas.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Just a very short comment on this, Benedict.
Yeah, it's about as far removed from my field of expertise as is possible to be Netflix and movies and such. I haven't watched a lot of them. I think it's possible to do well. It's just that the couple of times I've seen these things, I mean, I think Troy, for example, was a crime against humanity, I would say. There are films where you can say that maybe, okay, you could at least tell that they made an effort to make it a little bit like, to reflect something of the time. I think there were elements, now of course talking about Rome, but I think there were elements in the movie Gladiator where you could tell, okay, they actually tried to capture a little bit of something of what it was in those days. I think also of, I didn't watch the whole thing, but the first couple of episodes of the HBO series Rome, obviously they had to have a penis and a naked pair of breasts in every scene, so that was unfortunate. But at least in terms of trying to capture the mentality of those times, you could tell there was a little bit of an effort of kind of showing it, of the rawness of how it was and kind of putting it outside of the Christian moral world in which we live today. So I think it's possible to do it. I just don't think that it has been done very well very often, but can't really count more than that.
I will collect the last question from the public. Please. We don't have time, so we will speak about it. I have an announcement. Thank you for this very interesting discussion and also the questions. We have MCC Brussels on October 23rd, an important event. We will remember the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. And you are all invited. Please click on our website. You will get all informations. You are all invited. Zsófi, of course, and the List Institute are VIP guests on our event. And now, I don't know whether we have the answer on the initial question, who is afraid of the ancient Greece, but now we will have an opportunity to continue the discussion. We have good Hungarian wine, good Hungarian food, and please participate. Thank you.